was thinking maybe we could have something like a second microphone, but then we don't. Okay, today we discussed a lot about, in your presentations, we're covering the topic of the landmark, which is really, really complicated in one way, simple in one way, but also hiding quite a depth that I would love to elaborate a little bit with you together. We have, in a way, criticized the architecture of star architects, right, in the cities that don't, that don't fit or ignore or is dissonant with the local environment. Paying attention to this landmarks who give priority to local environment, to social and cultural context, as well as existing urban structures, right? But I would like to come back a little bit and then maybe deconstruct or clarify this notion of landmark. Actually, what is a landmark? How can we actually define it? Because I found that it goes beyond the notion of architecture or the built structure, especially if we look at it from the, let's say, semiology of communication, because this is kind of an act of communication. And even looking at the etymology of the word, it is landmark, and then it talks about some kind of a boundaries, limits, frontier. And if to take the most cited probably definition of landmark by Sorrow and Hertels, which is the landmarks are geographical objects of outstanding visual, cultural, and structural properties, right? But the other dictionaries make it a little bit wider. Let's say the Webster says that this is the object or structure on land that is easy to see and recognize. The second explanation goes to the building or place that was important in the history. And the third, a very important event or achievement. So we are talking about the easy to see and recognize. We are talking about the easy and see, recognized not only now, but also in the past. So we are actually talking about the memories or the location of the memories. And this was also topic touched by the speakers like David. And it's something like, we speak about the spaces that are physical but also mental. So what do you think about that?
In my point of view, you describe like many values that a landmark needs to have to become one. But I would add another one on top, which is the sense of ownership by the users. You said memory, and we have discussed how buildings that they don't belong to the context, they finally ended being part of the context, like the Eiffel Tower, some of them. There's a way of which these buildings perform that finally generate an engagement, and then locals and foreigners somehow become like part of it. It becomes part of the memory. And I think this is the part that I don't know how you design that, but it's at the will of the people, of the user. So finally, what you are designing geometrically, the jury is the final user. And when this happens, that they accept it as part of them, they become owners of them, then I think it becomes a landmark.
Thank you. David, maybe you have some ideas on the topic?
I really agree. It seems to me that we can accept that landmarks exist, but they become adopted somehow. And it seems hubristic for an architect to say, I will design a landmark. And I think a good project would be to list failed landmarks, right? To try and identify those attempts where things fail to be adopted. So I was sort of doing that a bit with the Palace of Culture, because it only becomes adopted very late. So I was thinking about in Kleiburg, when you have a lovely phrase where you're talking about sort of landmarks of the everyday. Do you think that those occupants in those apartments have adopted their homes as landmarks. And I suppose I wouldn't even use the word landmark. I wonder if they have a kind of curatorial sensibility. Do they have a sense that they're not just living in these places, but they're taking care of these places because they have a history and a kind of significance that goes beyond the ordinary itself?
Well, of course, I would love to say that everybody does that, but that's of course not so. That's not how it works. But there's a much higher sense of ownership than I expected in a way, and we see this in small little things, especially when there were some issues with the quality of the work done by the contractor, and then the homeowners, they went to the contractor and said, hey, there's a problem, fix it, because you did something which is not of quality. And then the contractor came with the solution of a contractor, which is to put a piece of plastic on top of it or something. And then they said, no. This project is part of a storyline of dealing with this piece of the city, and this has been done in a very kind of modest but very specific way. We're not going to put some plastic on top of it. We're going to make it good in this line of thinking. So, and of course, this is not, if you ask 500 people living there, I don't think all 500 of them will give you this answer. But there is this sense of ownership, and that they're part of something which goes beyond their own living comfort. And in that sense, I think it works.
Because we know that in Marseille, in the Gylytė, there's a kind of sense in which people have chosen to move there because they wish to somehow care for the building. And in London, Erno Goldfinger's work, who was a brutalist architect, he designed a number of towers, and people very actively choose to live there. But what's quite striking is the shifting class profile of those people, right? Because those are not the original inhabitants. So again, if you don't mind me asking, has there been a big shift in the profile of the people who live in those apartments?
Yeah, quite. The building was slated for demolition, so all the people had been moved out that were originally living there, which was a very mixed group of people. Like the Vermeulen is the most diverse most diverse neighborhood in all of Amsterdam. And I think we added even more diversity to it by having other people moving in. Some people claim it's kind of a hipster building. It's not. There are living hipsters there. You can't keep them out. But it's a majority. Yeah. No, but there's just an incredible wide range of people who've just adopted the building as a place to make their living environment possible, which they don't have any other options for in the city. So, but I think, and I think that's also kind of apart from an architect designing a landmark, there has to first have to be a question asked the architect to design a landmark, and I think to which problem is a landmark a solution? And I think that's a very interesting, because and that's why I also noted this issue of everyday life. I think in everyday life, landmarks don't really have a role. There are specific places in everyday life which are more meaningful to you than others, but everybody has a set of these things. So everybody has his own kind of individual network of landmarks which kind of define the important places in the city for him. So I think if you're really talking about landmarks on a kind of a city level or even on a national level, then you really have to kind of define a kind of narrative of which this landmark becomes a marker. And I think that's the difficult thing, and that goes way beyond architecture, I think.
I would very agree with you. I mean, talking about the landmarks, we actually are talking about the very personal understanding of landmark as an orientation. For example, the KAFe around the corner, the couple has met once, is a very important landmark for them, but not for everybody. And when we are talking that the landscapes are, landmarks are like for the city and nations, we should probably talk about the identity, but then again, the identity that was mentioned many times today has also the very broad meaning. Identity is there is one identity for the city or the nation, or are we talking about the identities? I loved your actually notion of network of identities, which makes us also think what is a landmark for one meaning or identity for one community, and what is for the other. How do we collaborate and share those values in the city. What do you think?
Sometimes it's very, very simple, everything. Do you know the story about Eiffel Tower and how it actually survived? Because it was built for World Trade, some kind of exhibition or something like that, and everybody hated, and it was to be destroyed after the exhibition. But you know, underneath every building is the ownership or architect or some kind of person who believes in that. And it was actually Eiffel itself who actually did not design the tower himself also, but he believed so much that it will be landmark and it has to stay, that he convinced actually whole Paris that if they would build the office in the top floor of Eiffel Tower, it will be very good to observe the weather of Paris. And it was built the office for like weather prognosis, and actually this guy lived there and forecasted weather for the Paris. This is the only reason it was not demolished. And only then, after some years and some even like decades to come, it became a landscape, not a landscape, a landmark for everybody, and it became needed. It became part of like a family member or something like that. So this is, I think, also, you know, people change and people adapt to its environment, and it's very, very simple actually with people like that.
So you are selling that architects sell ideas and images, as David today showed us. You know, the images of the buildings and the realities sometimes do not match, right? So this has to do a lot with this maybe memory of the landscape in the memory or in the mental space of the consciousness.
Yeah, I think the word landmark is dangerous, but there was a time in which, and still a time maybe, in which the architect was designing the identity. And I think what is successful, one of the things that is very successful in your building, you were saying when a landmark is an answer for a problem, I think that you were like giving a building a storytelling, an attitude, and a meaning for people to project their own identities. It was not a neutral. Making it neutral, it become like meaningful, because everyone today in this like global time and Instagram and whatever, they need to project their own identity. So you provided the perfect canvas for them to have their own storytelling. So in some ways, iconic architecture is selling the architect story, and this kind of community-based like architecture is selling something for which you can write your own book. And I think that's the meaningful part of the building.
So communities are co-curating and co-creating the landmark itself. Or what do you think?
I think so. I put in this slide of all these kind of useless buildings, because now, despite that the Eiffel Tower had a kind of an excuse of usefulness, maybe to keep it up, but it is of course essentially useless buildings. And I think these buildings are, because they don't have any specific use, they are not owned by anybody specifically. They are open to appropriation and to other all kinds of, to be a kind of ideas projected onto them. And I think that's true. But I think what I think also what you said about the hotel, I mean, kind of working with a project, that it's not just kind of looking at it and making a selfie or something, which is very kind of a passive relationship to one of these objects. But then when you're actually working with it and on it, then it becomes a kind of a container of all these things, and it kind of really grows into each other. I think that's why I think there are two kinds of landmarks in that sense: the kind of the passive landmark, maybe, and an active landmark. And just
what I really heard about from today's session, that we are mainly shifting from the spatial or the structural landmarks towards the modest, or the other ways to act actually as an architecture. It's not that that we are living in the landscape or the environment of very shouting architecture, right? So to make it another landmark is not necessarily to shout. So there is a shift, I think, in the acting mode. That's what your project actually is showing, that we are talking about the different reality of architecture. We talk about the community, getting involved with the community building. I mean, that everybody could find out or find their place in creating the spaces that they need most of all.
Yeah, but on the other hand, I think also the reality is that in a global competition for labor, for intelligent labor forces, for companies, etc. I think these landmarks can also become what is said as kind of a logo, a kind of a part of a branding of a place, of a city, of a region, apart from all kinds of kind of political ambitions to project a certain image to the outside world. But so I think that's also reality. So I think it's maybe good to distinguish these two realities and see on what level you are working.
But when we talk about the city image for or with the landscape or landmark architecture, right? So it is question: is this the landmark for locals, or is it the landmark for tourists who come? I mean, the outsiders. Is this also landmark for whom? This might be the question also. Do you think this differs?
I think landmark in everyday life in the history meant that it's you work, you work, sleep. It's very, very routine. And landmark like church or like theater or something like this, they mark your special moments. And now I think our understanding changed. And now we don't think that we live only for special moments. We live now. So we live now, and yet now this second, and then every second, and we want these special moments every second now. So this means that it cannot be like landmarks, all around, but it means that we want to live in quality. And what I meant also in my speech, we are looking and searching for the meaning and for quality in all the surroundings. And if we say it's marking, so we don't segment our time anymore. And I think this is the main shift in our understanding of the world itself.
Landmark and quality. Did I get that right? I mean, how would others react to that?
This is, philosophical term, and we can discuss it like maybe on dinner. It's better, but
with some wine.
Yeah, I think yeah.
No, but I think the philosophical part it's important. In my point of view, my personal interest, I think master planning was too much active by the architects, like Le Corbusier. It's like, this is the master plan, so you live like this. And now that people is empowered and they don't like to be told how do they live, and they want to have leisure, work, and whatever in the same community, there's a way that kind of like freaks me out a little bit in how you design this, how you incorporate like the random in the process of design. I personally I feel safe designing things that are systematic. But the idea of a systematic master planning, it's not possible in my mind anymore. You need to frame some possibilities, like a table of chess and some instructions for others to play. And then the randomness allows them to be appropriate of the system, and then create their own space, and they are somehow, I like the idea of curators. They are the curators of the space. You're just putting some tools over there. But these also scares me like a lot, because are we all the architects, the ones setting some kind of rules? So what kind of level of activeness do we have in the process? That's where I don't have an answer. Doesn't he have one?
You have.
It just reminds me of a theory that was developed by Oskar Hansen, who was a Polish architect in the late 1950s. And he argued that architects always overdetermine. And so what architecture ought to do is generate open forms. He called it open form theory, that enabled users, or I don't really like the word user, but occupant or whatever, right? To be able to somehow shape their environment. So that's what's kind of interesting about your work. But it comes almost as a dismantling of the architecture, whereas his proposition is to somehow from the outset create kind of parameters which allow for a degree of completion. And that's a kind of humanistic view of the world that I suppose quite a few Team 10 architects had a kind of view on. Just one observation I'd make. I'm a little bit kind of cautious about the individuation in this conversation, because it points to a very heightened sense of individuality. It's what we do, it's what how we live in this moment or whatever. But one of the things about landmarks is their capacity to be the focus of a collective activity. So I know this is not quite a landmark in the architectural sense, but I was thinking a little bit about the centre of London and Trafalgar Square. And Trafalgar Square has at its heart this big monument to British military might. But it's been the place where in the 1830s, people who wanted to effectively extend democracy chose to gather and demonstrate. It's been the place where suffragettes chose to gather and demonstrate when they wanted women's votes. When people were fighting fascism in the 1930s, it's the place they chose to go. So there's something about the capacity for a landmark to have layers of history that people choose to return to because they know that they can activate that history by creating a kind of genealogy. And that's collective in two ways. It's in a synchronic and a diachronic way, because you're meeting together with other people, but you're also meeting your forebears. There's a kind of sense of history. And I'm really interested in when a building can act as a kind of a cultural or a political memory for a wider sense than the individual. And clearly, that was not the intention of that landmark, that monument. It wanted to do exactly the opposite, but our capacity to turn it round is another way of us engaging with landmarks in ways which might dispute the architectural and the political imagination. I'll stop ranting.
Thank you for comment. I think you have already mentioned that, the memory to remember, but also the landmarks to forget, right? The places to forget it in both way traffic. Maybe someone from the audience, which is really not that big, to ask some questions. Everybody seems to be very tired. Shall we wrap up? Finishing, with the new findings of the paradoxes of the landscape, landmarks somehow. But I very much loved these everyday landmarks. I think they fit in the way of the new concept of our new life. I also enjoyed this network of identities, which means, you can talk about the varieties of identities that need to be, I don't know if they need to be landmarked, but maybe this is not talking about the landmark architecture, but landmarking architecture. This is also the way around. And finally, we somehow came to the conclusion that architects now are the curators of the space. So I am not sure everybody are content with that findings, but I think we continue our talking through the dinner, and everybody who wants to approach our speakers, you are welcome to do that now. Thank you very much. Thank you all.